Millionaire walks into interview, finds poor ex-wife and twins throwing birthday party. Hey, beautiful souls. Welcome back to the channel. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from today? I see you, I feel your hearts, and I'm so grateful you're here. Now, let me ask you something. What happens when a billionaire with everything comes face to face with the only thing he ever truly lost? This isn't just a story. It's a storm of heartbreak, second chances, and a moment that brought a powerful man down to his knees, not in defeat, but in love. So grab a tissue, get cozy, and prepare your heart, because this story, it's going to stay with you. Ethan Blackwood stepped out of his custom Maybach as the golden morning light reflected off the towering glass building that bore his name. His polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the marble steps of Blackwood Enterprises. At just 30, he had achieved what most men only dreamed of. In their lifetimes, a billion-dollar empire, global influence, and the kind of magnetic presence that made entire rooms fall silent when he entered. His sapphire blue eyes, cool and calculating, surveyed the entrance with quiet authority, every step a declaration of control. Tall, impeccably groomed, and wrapped in an Italian suit tailored to his lean, athletic frame, he carried himself like a man who had conquered every obstacle. Women glanced his way with admiring awe, whispering behind manicured hands, while men adjusted their ties, hoping to mirror even a fraction of his command. But behind the sculpted jawline, the immaculate appearance, and the reputation for brilliance, Ethan wore a silence heavier than wealth. Beneath the perfectly composed exterior lived a man who had long abandoned the idea of softness. He spoke in numbers, moved in schedules, and breathed in expectations, never letting anyone too close. He didn't smile unless it served a purpose, didn't engage unless there was value, and certainly never opened up, not since her. His name echoed through boardrooms and financial districts like a storm. Colleagues feared him. Partners respected him. Employees obeyed him, but not a single soul truly knew him. Not the way she had, not the way Amara once did. Years ago, long before the marble floors, the penthouse meetings, and the private jets, Ethan had been a young, hungry man with nothing but ambition and raw intellect. He hadn't always been rich, but he had always been relentless. Money came quickly, so did power, and with them came walls, thick, cold, and impenetrable. Then somehow, through the cracks of his guarded world, she slipped in. Amara was not from his world. She didn't arrive wearing diamonds or designer brands. She carried herself with quiet confidence, grace carved into every step. Her deep brown skin glowing in the sun like a bronze goddess carved out of dusk. Her voice was soft but firm, her eyes kind but unflinching, and her presence disarmed him in a way that no one else ever had. She didn't want his money, didn't chase his last name, didn't care about Forbes lists. She challenged him, called out his arrogance, made him laugh without trying. And that terrified him, because Ethan had built a life of control, and Amara was the one thing he couldn't calculate. Their love was quick but not careless. It bloomed in stolen moments and quiet dinners, in conversations that stretched till dawn, in glances that said more than words ever could. It was intense, real and raw, so unlike anything he had prepared for. But with love came vulnerability, and Ethan had never learned how to be open without armor. His fear of losing control became his undoing. His pride, like a disease, infected the beautiful thing they had. One argument turned into many. Walls that had once come down between them began to rise again. Amara had wanted nothing but his heart, and Ethan, scared to hand it over, gave her distance instead. When he married her, it had been impulsive, passionate, a moment of rebellion against his own fears. But marriage meant permanence, commitment, things that scared him more than failure. And when the world whispered lies and doubts into his ear, he chose the cold safety of suspicion over the fragile beauty of trust. 4 months. That's all it took for him to ruin something sacred. 4 months until he signed the divorce papers with trembling hands and a clenched jaw, unable to look into her eyes as she walked out of his life. She hadn't begged. She hadn't cried. She just left, with her dignity intact and her silence louder than any scream. Since that day, Ethan hadn't spoken her name aloud. He buried her in the deepest corners of his memory and worked harder than ever to forget. He filled his days with meetings, his nights with empty encounters, and his heart with ice. And yet, every time he looked out the massive windows of his 42nd floor office, a strange hollowness echoed through his ribcage, like a home missing its soul. Success never tasted as sweet again. Accolades felt muted. He had become the man everyone envied, but also the man no one truly loved. His assistant greeted him that morning with the usual list of meetings, but his mind wandered as he walked through the executive hallway, lined with portraits of himself shaking hands with world leaders, celebrities and moguls. The reflection in the glass caught his attention, not of the building, but of himself, handsome, wealthy, powerful, and utterly alone. In a world that bowed before him, there was no one left who dared to look him in the eyes and ask, "Are you okay?" No one, except the one he had pushed away. As he stepped into his private elevator, pressing the button to the top floor, a flicker of something foreign crossed his face. Regret. It passed quickly, masked by the steel expression he wore like a crown. But it was there, a small, buried ache he hadn't felt in years. And somewhere in the quiet between floors, Ethan Blackwood, billionaire, icon, untouchable, realized that all the fortune in the world couldn't fill the space left behind by someone who had loved him without condition. He was the man everyone envied, but for all his power, he couldn't go back in time. And yet fate was preparing something he wasn't ready for. Ethan stood alone in the silence of his office, the cityscape stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the muted hum of traffic below like a distant whisper from a life he couldn't touch. His fingers grazed the glass as if trying to feel something through the cold pain. But all he found was reflection, his own, and a ghost behind his eyes. Her name echoed in his mind like a half-remembered song he once knew by heart but now couldn't hum. Without his throat tightening, Amara. The name tasted like sunlight and rain, like laughter after pain, like home before it was lost. She had entered his world during a charity event, a project meant to polish his company's image. But she became something far deeper than PR. She stood beneath string lights in a community center with paint on her hands. Barefoot on a canvas, she was helping children create. Her skin glowed like bronze kissed by firelight. Her curls pulled back in a messy bun, her laughter like wind chimes swaying on a quiet evening. She didn't look at him the way others did. She wasn't impressed by his status, nor intimidated by his title. She looked at him with clear, unflinching curiosity, as if trying to see through him, not at him. And somehow that gaze, so honest, so undeserving of deception, cracked something open in Ethan. He started showing up more often to the project, pretending to check on progress, but really just orbiting her warmth. She spoke to him like a person, not a CEO. She challenged his cynicism, pushed back against his sarcasm. And when she laughed at his dry jokes, it was never forced, it was real. She taught him how to be still, how to be human, how to breathe without a reason. Their connection sparked in silence and bloomed in moments. Her slipping a coffee into his hand before he asked, him waiting outside her building with an umbrella, her head on his chest during a rooftop sunset, neither of them planned. Within 2 months, they were standing in a quiet courthouse, her in a simple ivory dress, him in a navy suit with trembling hands, promising forever like two fools who thought love was enough. His friends mocked it. The press speculated. His board frowned, but for a brief time Ethan didn't care. He woke up next to her and felt human. He laughed more. He softened. But wealth was a shadow with claws, and soon it began to scrape. Rumors surfaced, jealous whispers about Amara's intentions. Friends told him she was after his fortune. His mother warned him about her background. His pride twisted her independence into defiance. He started to question her silences, misread her strength as coldness, mistook her calm for detachment. He began working longer hours, choosing boardrooms over breakfasts, briefings over evening walks. They fought, not about love but about trust, about how little of it he was willing to give. Amara would stand in the hallway of their penthouse, arms crossed, eyes tired, asking, "What are we even building, Ethan? If you won't let me in." And he had no answer. His love for her terrified him. It made him feel small, exposed. So instead of fighting for her, he fought with her. He didn't cheat. He didn't hit. But he neglected. He withheld. And worst of all, he doubted her. The turning point came on a night thunder peeled across the sky like an omen. Rain lashed the windows. Amara had been waiting for hours. Dinner cold. Candles burned to stubs. He came in late, distracted, distant. They argued. Voices rose. Words became weapons. And when she whispered through tears, "You're not losing me to someone else. You're losing me to yourself," he froze. He didn't beg. He didn't reach for her. He walked to his desk, pulled out a folder, and placed the divorce papers on the table like a verdict. Cold, precise, devastating. She signed with a hand that trembled and walked away without another word. The echo of the door closing behind her louder than any scream he'd ever heard. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Amara had walked out not just with a broken heart, but with something far greater, something he had unknowingly left with her, a secret, one that would soon change everything. 3 years passed, but Ethan felt none of them. Seasons came and went in glass reflections. Boardrooms blurred into airports, and wealth continued to pour in. But the man behind the empire had turned to ice. He had not loved. He had not touched. He had not even dared to speak her name aloud since the night. She vanished like smoke from his life. He convinced himself that she had moved on, that perhaps she'd gone back to wherever home had been before him, though the truth was, he had never asked enough questions to even know where that was. His life became numbers, deals, and lonely silence. His penthouse echoed at night. He buried himself in work, dismissing anything that felt too warm, too human, too reminiscent of her. Then came a Thursday morning like any other. Rain sliding down the windows, a fresh press release on his desk, and his assistant informing him of a final candidate for the head of a new charity division. "Room 3A, sir." "She's early," the assistant noted without emotion. Ethan glanced at the file disinterestedly, grabbing it with robotic precision, unaware that the moment he opened that conference room door, his world would stop spinning. As he stepped inside, expecting another clipboard-holding executive, his breath caught so violently in his chest, he thought his lungs had forgotten how to function. The folder slipped from his hand and hit the carpeted floor with a dull thud. Standing there, framed by the soft glow of morning light spilling through the blinds, was Amara. She wasn't dressed for war, nor was she dressed for some grand confrontation. Just a modest olive blouse, her hair tied back simply, her face older but still heartbreakingly serene. But what undid Ethan wasn't just her. It was the sight of 2 small children beside her, their tiny fingers wrapped around balloon strings and cupcakes, carefully decorated with 5 candles. And then her voice, soft, unshaken, layered in a pain too old to weep, cut through the silence like a secret finally surfacing. "Happy birthday, Elijah and Eliana," she whispered, not to him, but to the children at her side. Ethan couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The room tilted and time frayed at the edges. The twins turned in perfect synchronicity, and the moment their crystal blue eyes met his unmistakable, piercing gaze mirrored in miniature, his knees almost buckled. The boy squinted with quiet curiosity, and the girl tilted her head in the way Amara used to when something didn't make sense. The boy's small voice broke the silence, unafraid and pure. "Mommy, is he the birthday surprise?" Ethan's heart fractured in that instant. Not cracked, fractured like a frozen lake under sudden weight. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Amara looked at him without accusation, without rage, just a weary calm, as though she'd rehearsed this day in her head 1,000 times. Her hands trembled slightly, but she kept her posture straight, protective. Ethan stared at the twins, 5 years old, born months after she left. The math stabbed him harder than any betrayal ever could. And yet, even now, he didn't know what to say. Didn't know whether to fall to his knees, scream in disbelief, or simply walk toward them and beg for one moment, one word, one chance. The little girl, Eliana, he knew it already, somehow gave him a shy smile, and it felt like his soul collapsed inward. His eyes flicked to Amara, silently asking, "Why?" But she only looked down at the cupcakes and lit the candles with a match she brought in her coat pocket, like she had planned to make this moment small, meaningful, and entirely hers. No press, no drama, just a mother celebrating a milestone for the children he never knew he had. The flame on the candles flickered gently as the children clapped softly and sang for themselves. And Ethan stood frozen, the walls of his world crumbling in utter silence. The man who had everything now stood face to face with the one thing he had unknowingly lost. And it had two voices, two smiles, and one woman who had once held his entire heart. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something unstoppable rush through him, not power, not rage, but longing, regret, and something terrifyingly close to love. The room suddenly wasn't a conference room anymore. It was a reckoning. The flame of the candles had barely flickered out when Ethan turned abruptly, chest rising like a wave about to crash, and stormed out of the conference room, the glass door swinging behind him, with a hollow thud that echoed through the hallway like an unfinished sentence. His shoes struck the polished marble like thunder, each step faster than the last. Not sure where he was going, only that the ground beneath him felt like it was falling away. "Ethan!" Her voice called out, soft but urgent, carrying a tremble he'd never heard before. Not anger, not accusation, just grief wrapped in dignity. He stopped at the end of the hall, back turned, fists clenched at his sides. She caught up, breath catching as she reached him, the hem of her blouse fluttering with her hurried steps. "I tried," she said quietly. "I tried to tell you. But you never looked back." Her words didn't shout, they ached. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he still didn't turn. "Why?" he finally asked, voice low, hoarse. "Why would you hide them from me?" Amara's eyes welled up, but no tears fell. She had cried enough over him once. Now she only spoke truth. "Because you were too broken to love me then, and I wasn't going to let you make our children feel the way I did. Unseen, unloved, unchosen." The silence that followed was heavy, almost sacred. Ethan slowly turned, his face pale, unreadable. "They're mine," he said. Though it wasn't a question, it was a confession, an awakening. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "They were born 7 months after I left. I named them after your favorite book characters, Elijah and Eliana." He staggered back a step, like her words had physically struck him. "You never asked for anything. Not support, not even my name on a certificate." She shook her head slowly. "I didn't need your name. I needed peace. I needed to raise them with warmth, not under the weight of your silence." He swallowed hard, emotion crawling up his throat like fire. "Why didn't you come forward when the press destroyed you? You could have said anything. You could have ruined me." Amara blinked, then looked him directly in the eyes, calm but fierce. "Because I loved you. I wasn't going to use our pain to make myself feel powerful. And I didn't want them growing up thinking, love is something that turns into revenge." Her words sank into him like needles under skin, slow, deep, irreversible. The image of those two small faces, his faces, looking up at him with joy and innocence, now burned behind his eyelids. "You gave them birthdays. Without me, you taught them to smile." "Without me," he whispered, more to himself than her, voice cracking like old wood under pressure. "I taught them to believe," she said, "to believe that love doesn't always come when you want it. But it doesn't have to be ugly when it ends." Ethan leaned against the wall, head back, eyes searching the ceiling like it might offer some forgiveness. "I thought I was protecting myself by pushing you away. But I see now I was just punishing us both." Amara stepped back slightly, folding her arms not in defense, but as if to hold herself together. "You were drowning in pride. Ethan, you thought love was control, but it never was. It was trust. And when that broke, so did everything." He nodded slowly, face hollow, soul unraveling from the inside. "Did they ever ask about me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Sometimes," she said. "I told them the truth, that once there was a man I loved enough to hope for, that maybe one day he'd be ready to love them too." That shattered him. No scream, no tear, no outburst, just a still, raw silence as Ethan sank slowly onto the leather bench lining the hallway, hands trembling in his lap. All the money, the empire, the illusion of control, none of it weighed as much as the truth. Sitting beside him now, he had lost time. He had lost first steps, first words, tiny fingers reaching out in the dark. And yet somehow she had carried all of it without bitterness. Alone, with dignity he could barely fathom. Amara stood still, watching him, her expression not vengeful, not smug, just quietly broken. And in that moment, as the light from the hallway windows fell gently between them, Ethan felt something he hadn't in years, not power, not anger, but guilt. And for once he didn't push it away. He let it bury him. Evening settled over the city like a soft confession, its amber light washing the skyline in forgiveness he didn't feel he deserved. Ethan sat alone in his office, the towering windows behind him turning into a lens that framed the truth he could no longer outrun. Below, in the small park nestled between his empire's concrete foundations, he saw them, Amara and the twins, seated on a worn wooden bench beneath a jacaranda tree, its blossoms gently falling like blessings. They were laughing, small heads thrown back in joy, fingers sticky with icing from the smeared cupcakes she must have saved from earlier. Amara wiped a smudge off, Elijah's cheek with that same maternal grace she once used to tend to. Ethan's deepest wounds, the invisible ones, the ones behind his perfect suits and flawless posture. He pressed his palm against the cold glass, eyes locked on the scene below, and suddenly he was nowhere near the top floor of a billion-dollar tower. He was back in that tiny kitchen of their first apartment, where she used to hum soft Hindi tunes as she chopped vegetables, barefoot, hair messy, soul glowing. He remembered how she'd look over her shoulder and catch him staring, then say, "Love isn't grand gestures, Ethan, it's choosing someone when no one's watching." But he hadn't chosen her. He'd chosen pride, silence, control. He recalled the first morning she woke beside him and whispered, "Thank you for not letting the world harden you," as if she had truly believed he was more than what his reputation painted. And he'd believed it too, until fear turned him rigid, until whispers from boardrooms and shallow women cracked that belief, until his own scars spoke louder than her love. The sound of Eliana's laughter below tugged at something so fragile inside him. He feared it would break entirely. She had Amara's smile, but his dimples, they were his blood. His legacy not written in marble, but in the curve of their noses and the music of their joy. Watching them pass a single slice of cake between three hands as if it were a feast made. Something inside him crumble. Amara broke a piece for each child, then took the smallest for herself, still teaching them even now how to share what little you have. And Ethan remembered the nights she used to do that for him, when dinner was late, when business had drained him, when his voice had been cold, but she'd still kissed his forehead and said, "I know you're tired. Eat, love." The weight of memory became unbearable. He didn't just lose her, he threw her away, like collateral damage in a war. Against himself. He had mocked the way she loved gently, laughed freely, cried openly. He'd mistaken her softness for weakness, her devotion for dependence. And yet there she was, whole, strong, raising the two most beautiful pieces of him without bitterness, without demands, without ever telling the world what he'd done. A man like him didn't deserve peace. But watching her down there, he wanted it anyway, not for himself, but to give to them. To undo just a corner of the damage he'd sown with silence and distance. Amara reached into her bag and pulled out a worn children's book, one she used to read on rainy nights, and the twins huddled in close as she began to read aloud. Though he couldn't hear the words through glass and height, he could almost remember the cadence, the rhythm of her voice, the way it made even tragedy sound safe. He leaned his forehead against the window, breath fogging the glass. He had everything and nothing, power but no legacy, fame but no meaning. He had never known what home was until he saw her again. And now he knew he hadn't just broken a marriage, he had broken a sanctuary. And somehow, impossibly, they had rebuilt one without him. His fingers curled slightly against the window pane, as though trying to touch a life he had once held in his arms and let slip away. In that moment, the ache in his chest wasn't just guilt, it was longing, grief, and the first whisper of a plea he hadn't dared to make yet. Please, let it not be too late. The warmth of twilight faded into the velvet of night as Ethan sat across from Amara at an intimate corner, table bathed in soft golden light. The hum of quiet conversations, around them paling, in comparison to the storm he tried to steady inside. He'd chosen this restaurant not for its elegance, but for its history. It was where they'd once celebrated her birthday, where she'd worn that yellow dress and danced barefoot in the rain after dessert. And for a moment he'd thought he could believe in forever. Now, years later, he clutched the edge of the linen tablecloth, like it was the last piece of a life slipping from his grasp. Amara looked radiant in her simplicity. No makeup, no effort to impress, just authenticity like always. She glanced at the twins, seated between them, giddy from cake and overstimulation. "Thank you for coming," Ethan said, his voice calm but tight, like the words had barbed edges. She gave a gentle nod. "It's not for you, it's for them." He expected bitterness, but there was none, just measured strength, the kind born from choosing peace over pain. "I thought maybe we could talk. Find closure," he continued. Amara tilted her head slightly. "Closure," she repeated, not mockingly, but as if tasting the weight of it. "You think one dinner can stitch up what silence tore open?" Ethan looked down, fingers tracing the rim of his glass. "I don't know, I wanted a beginning, maybe, or at least the truth." She exhaled slowly. "Then here's mine," she said, her voice steady. "I applied for the charity role not to cross your path. I didn't even know you'd be there. I wanted to build something of my own, something that didn't carry your shadow or your name. I've been working 3 jobs, raising 2 children, and still showing up with a smile. I didn't bring them today to win sympathy or start a war." She paused, her gaze meeting his with heartbreaking clarity. "I brought them because they deserve to know who their father is, before the world tells them who he isn't." Ethan's throat tightened. He had braced for anger, prepared for blame. But this measured dignity, this restrained grace, disarmed him more than fury ever could. "I was wrong," he said, the words brittle. "You were brave," she corrected, not as praise but as fact. "And I was a coward." He nodded, yes. There was no defense left in him, just regret, just silence. Then, without warning, Elijah leaned into Ethan's side, tiny arms curling around his waist, eyelids drooping. The small boy, his son, rested his cheek against Ethan's shoulder and sighed. The contact struck harder than any shouted accusation. Ethan froze, heart clenched, unsure if he deserved the comfort of that weight. But Eliana followed, scooting beside him, grabbing his hand with a sleepy grin. In the quiet of that restaurant, with the world hushed and the candle flickering low, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not power, not control, but peace. Unfiltered, undeserved, but real. Amara watched the scene unfold with unreadable eyes. Not cold, not forgiving, just present. "They don't hate you," she whispered. "They don't know how to. Children love without condition, until someone teaches them otherwise." The words pierced through him like sunlight into a sealed room. Ethan placed a gentle kiss on Elijah's head, something breaking loose in his chest. "I want to learn how to be better," he said, voice trembling. "Not just for them, but because of them. Because of you." Amara looked away, her lips pressed into a faint line. "Love still lives somewhere inside me, Ethan," she said quietly. "But it no longer begs to be chosen. It no longer waits for rescue." He nodded, tears stinging behind his eyes. Not because she was punishing him, but because she wasn't. And that grace, that refusal to make him grovel, made him ache more than any revenge ever could. 1 week later, beneath chandeliers that had witnessed 100 corporate victories, but never a moment this human, Ethan stood on stage at the annual Blackwood Foundation Gala, dressed in the same pristine suit that once symbolized power but now barely held together the man inside. The auditorium was packed, board members in tailored tuxedos, media flashing cameras, employees murmuring behind cocktail glasses, all expecting Another cold speech on philanthropy, another promise wrapped in PR. But this night was different. The lights dimmed slightly as he stepped to the microphone, not with notes, but with something heavier in his chest than any prepared words. "Tonight," he began, voice steady but low, "is not about business, or power, or image. It's about failure, mine." The room hushed. "I spent years thinking I'd built an empire, that I had everything. But I walked away from the only thing that ever truly made me a man." The screen behind him lit up with a photo, Amara and the twins at the park, smiling under the purple blossoms. Gasps rippled through the room. And then, from the side stage, she stepped into view, Amara, in a simple sky-blue dress, the twins at her side, holding her hands like they were holding up the sky. Ethan turned toward them. The moment their eyes met, it was as if the world fell away. He slowly stepped forward, heart pounding, past stunned board members and whispered questions. The twins looked up at him, wide-eyed and curious, and in that look, he found all the answers he had once buried beneath ambition. "3 years ago, I lost something far more valuable than money," he said, voice trembling now. "I lost her. I lost them, not because they left me, but because I was too blind to see them." Then, without theatrics, without pride, he dropped to his knees, not in performance but in reverence, before Amara, before the mother of his children, before the woman who loved him when he was unworthy, and walked away when he didn't change. A silence blanketed the room as cameras clicked in disbelief. "Amara," he whispered, eyes shining, "I never saw your worth until I saw it in their eyes. I won't pretend I deserve you. I won't ask you to erase the pain, but I am asking for a second chance. Not as the man I was, but as the father I want to become. And maybe in time, the man you once believed I could be." The room held its breath. Amara stood frozen, eyes wide, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, it was as if all the years collapsed into this singular, fragile heartbeat, and then, softly, surely tears welled in her eyes. She looked down at the twins, who instinctively stepped forward. Each placing one small hand in Ethan's, they smiled, innocent and whole, forming a bridge he never thought he'd cross. Amara's voice was barely above a whisper, but it echoed louder than any applause. "Let's start with being a father," she said. Ethan's head bowed, overcome, lips parting into a trembling smile, not the polished smile of press conferences, not the arrogant grin of a tycoon, but the broken, beautiful smile of a man finally made whole. The crowd stood, not in formal applause, but in awe of vulnerability, of healing, of something real. As Amara stepped forward and gently helped him to his feet, the twins wrapping their arms around them both, Ethan didn't feel like a CEO reclaiming his image. He felt like a man reclaiming his heart. And in that moment, surrounded by the world he'd once ruled, he realized he'd been crowned by something far more precious than wealth, forgiveness, family, and a love that survived the ruins.